Hey, everybody, and welcome to another week of Speakeasy Reviews. And in my 40s, I forgot the name of the show there for a very split second. Andrew, how you doing this week?
I'm doing well, and other than the occasional senior moment that plagues me as well.
Just for everybody who's watching this week, as you've seen from the title, you've probably clicked on it. We are doing a versus the Superman, the original theatrical version, the Lester version, versus what Andrew, you've made me aware is the Donner cut, which has come out recently. And this was new to me. I had to spend quite a bit of time researching the provenance of this film.
Well, speaking of old man, you might want to define recently. The Donner cut's now 15 years old, but which...
Yeah, but it was released not too long ago. So I thought with
2006. 2006.
Was it 2006? God, I am getting old because that seems like it's not that long ago.
No, it doesn't seem that long ago. On that level, I grant you. I remember it came out shortly after Superman Returns came out. Like when they released Superman Returns to DVD, you could get this movie in the box set, which is how I got Superman 2 with the Richard Donner cut. So it was, how they released the movie over the summer, and by Christmas, it's out on DVD. So it was December or something of 2006.
Well, I think looking into it, because you've known about this for a little while, and this was something you wanted to raise earlier, and I'm glad you had, because I grew up. I was more of a Marvel person growing up, but I did Superman. I think for everybody was the first superhero, and I think
first of all, there were no other when we were little kids. There weren't. I mean, given we are men of a certain age, and when we were, before Batman came out in '89, there weren't any other big production superhero movies that I can think of that were around.
There was TV shows, but
there were TV shows,
yeah. And this was the Superman franchise was the first real big budget superhero film.
My point exactly.
And the Superman, well, okay, this sort of opened up a thought for me, just comparing Superman, the films, and it reminded me how I think I preferred the second one to the first one, if we forget about this Donner-Lester conversation.
Yeah, this is a question that comes up a lot. I do believe that the second one, if you look at the aggregation of reviews, tends to get better notices than the first one. I certainly remember my father saying that Superman 2 was an example of a sequel being better than the original. I have to say that in my dotage, if you want, my old age, as I moved past, as a kid, I probably like Superman 2 better because it has more action, right? It is more about, Superman from the start of the movie. The theatrical release, the one we all grew up with and are most familiar with, presumptively, that opening sequence that they designed with the nuclear bomb in Paris and all, it's really great. It's really, really great. It's exciting. It's well choreographed. It's well done. Superman, the first one, the original, takes a while to get started. We have to do 45 minutes on the, origin story of Superman. And especially now, although I suppose then, but with the movies having become somewhat iconic, I think people's patience for that amount of expositive, just narrative stuff to run through it is limited, right? Like 45 minutes before you meet Superman, and then even when you see him fly for a second, and then it takes another little bit of time before he does anything.
Yes,
but I will say, having said all that, my thing is I actually do prefer the first one. I think the first one hits the notes that they were looking for a little bit more than the second one does.
I think what makes the first one slower is the bad guy is not somebody he can actually physically take on. It's Lex Luthor is criminal mastermind. And I think with Superman, the one thing I thought about when we review these films, it's how much latitude you give Superman, because I think the character itself is almost, when you first see it on the screen, the colors are it's almost like seeing Superman on the screen for the first time. I remember this reminded me of the first time I went to a Phillies game. and the first time I saw the field. So this was the thought that came to my head, because you know how it is when you go to your first professional baseball game and you walk out onto the, into the field area, and you see this expanse of green and these colors and these sounds and these smells. And Superman, was a comic book character. And I think the first time the audience, the public, saw a superhero on the big screen, it was very much vibrant and very sort of theatrical. And I think Superman, the film, gets some passes for some of its flamboyant nature in storytelling. I don't think there's, as far as, we always talk about continuity with these older films and some of the more ridiculous plot lines. I think Superman is riddled with it, but I think it gets a pass because of where it sits in the genre.
If you're worried about realism, you've checked into the wrong theater if you're trying to watch Superman, right?
But I'm not talking about realism. I'm talking about continuity to the story. So if you, for instance, if you look at
internal consistency.
Yeah, so I'm not worried about realism, but I think Superman gets a bit of a pass because it's more than just, I think, a superhero film. It's the quintessential first draft. It's the first superhero film that was made. Well, and this whole Donner Lester thing really raised for me, the question of how important storytelling is when you have this sort of unbelievable subject matter to contend with, and how you make it compelling and interesting. And there, for me, was a big gulf, a surprising gulf in the difference in how the story was told between Donner and Lester. And they had very different resources at hand.
They did. And I will also say, keep in mind that the Donner cut that exists, that you saw, that I've seen,
unfinished.
It's unfinished. And also because he was not, so just, and if anyone doesn't know this, but I'm assuming if you're clicking on this, you probably do, but for the benefit of anyone who doesn't, they initially set out, just like Back to the Future Part 2 and 3, to film Superman 1 and 2 basically at the same time. And in fact, I know you listened to some of the DVD commentary on the Superman 2 Richard Donner cut. Did you listen to the part where Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz, the original screenwriter, although Mario Puzo is credited for the story, Mankiewicz did a lot of the actual screenwriting on this first one especially. Donner talks about at one point, and Mankiewicz too, about how not only, you would have with big name actors like Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando, and of course Christopher Reeve was a nobody at this point. They were the two stars. That not only would you have they have to be finished by date X because they have other commitments, other projects, but they also had a start date. Like, your production's ready to go or not, this is the window you have them for.
Yeah.
From January 1st to March 1st or whatever it is. So what ended up happening was, and you see it when you really watch them and look at them side by side, you can see what's going on, is that the parts that Richard Donner was able to film in Superman 2 are really chiefly the parts with Lex Luthor and Marlon Brando.
Yep.
And anything that didn't involve them got, in the end, they kind of had to shift gears on their plan. They decided probably 3/4 into the way of shooting the first Superman film, they were too far behind schedule. The producer said, that's it. We got to get the first one out. So set aside doing any filming for anything that's going to wind up in Superman 2. Just finish 1. Yeah. And in doing that, they not only finished 1, but they also, for example, at the end of the Richard Donner cut, Superman pulls the trick of zipping around the world again.
Yeah.
Well, from what I understand, that was supposed to be the original ending of Superman 2, and Superman 1 wasn't supposed to have that as an ending at all. Instead, it was supposed to end on a cliffhanger where you would see the rocket, there's 2 rockets in Superman 1, and he promises Miss Tessmacher that he's going to go get the first one before he gets the second one, so she'll take the kryptonite off him. So he does that, and he grabs the first one and he pushes it out into space. Then the other one, while he's doing that, hits, and so he ends up having to deal with the aftermath of its hit. But the way the first one was supposed to end was that first one goes out into space, blows up, and that's how those guys get, released from the Phantom Zone. And that was basically supposed to be the last shot of the first one, is them escaping, and then roll credits, next year see it Superman 2, right?
Yeah.
And it was going to be one continuous story. But they ended up having to come up with a different ending for the original Superman. So he spins the world around in the first one. And then when it came time to do Superman 2, they had the footage that they'd shot with Brando and Hackman, anything involving those guys. And of course, if Christopher Reeve or any of the villains were in those scenes, then they're there too. But they had to go back and actually shoot. So all the honeymoon stuff where they're posing as honeymooners in Canada, anything that's just him and Margot Kidder is basically shot by Richard Lester. And so that's where, when they're putting that Richard Donner cut together, they only have so much to work with, because a lot of the things that he would have done, he did not get to do because he didn't come back to film, to finish up Superman 2. And also he was forced to end Superman 1 in a way that was not originally intended.
Yeah. I think you end up with two directors who were hamstrung in very different ways. So
correct. Richard Lester is stuck with a certain amount of what he would not have done, and then has to make a movie around it.
Yeah.
Conversely.
And I think what struck me was how there was such a differentiation or deviation. And I wasn't aware that the element about the ending. And I think no matter when Superman was going to turn the Earth backwards, at any point in time, that was a bad idea as far as I'm concerned. At any time. Both endings, I could have done without either of those.
I mean, I think it's the biggest criticism of the first film. In the second film, it doesn't work at all. They just wanted a different ending. They did not like the way that Superman 2, as it was released, ended. And honestly, the idea that Superman has some kind of magic kiss that makes Lois forget things doesn't have a lot of internal logic to it either.
So let's come back to that, because maybe we should go through the film and look at those differences, and just maybe make an assessment on those key differences, and then we're going to score which one we like the best. And just before I get into it, so if I were to tell you what I found as far as what the Superman fandom I think prefer, would that skew you in any way at this stage, or should we save that?
Oh, I think I know what the Superman fandom prefer.
And I think what do you think it is? Just so that I maybe.
I think they prefer the Richard Donner cut.
Yeah, so that is the popular view. Now, looking at the film, let's start with the main difference. I think the first bit, and you highlighted it, was how Zod and crew were released from the Infinity or
Phantom Zone.
Phantom Zone. So in the Donner cut, like you said, they hit I guess an unexploded nuclear missile from the first one, and that releases them. And then in the Lester version, it was an explosion from the scene in Paris that was added. What was your preference between those two? I mean, do you feel like we can go
the first is much? I think in terms of. I like the idea that they were supposed to be a continuous story. And I think the connection from film 1 to film 2 makes a lot more sense if it's the nuke that he shoves out into space. It has this kind of serendipity to it. And if you start thinking too hard about the plot of either Superman or Superman 2, but especially Superman 2, it doesn't matter whose cut it is. There's a lot of silliness in it. But at least it, with the missile being pushed out into space that he has saved, it kind of connects story elements together, and it continues and drives that same notion of things happen for a reason that clearly is stated throughout. Certainly the first Superman. I mean, it's what Superman's adoptive father says to him early on in the first film. Clark is complaining to his adoptive father, saying, because he plays the nerd, right, in high school, and you see how he's then treated by the jocks, right, as typical that you might expect, jocks treating nerds like they're dirt. And he complains to his dad. He's like, they don't understand. If I played on the football team, I could score a touchdown every time. And you see that he gets some of where the idea comes from him, that he's supposed to hide, or not hide, but like not be showy and not use, because I think how any human being would be if you actually had superpowers. Of course, you'd immediately think, well, how can I use this to enrich myself? Yeah. And he's got his stepfather in his ear, and his stepfather says to him, I think it's really one of the most poignant lines in any of the Superman films. He says, listen, I don't, all I know is you're here for a reason. I don't know whose reason or what reason it is, but you're here for a reason, and it's not to score touchdowns.
Yeah.
And that kind of sets the frame of there is a sort of guiding intelligence to what's going on, and things don't just happen willy-nilly. So the idea that missile gets, of course, on the one level, it's a coincidence of all the places in the space in the huge universe. You push this missile out into space that you're saving the world from, and it just happens to go right by the Phantom Zone. It's crazy, but it makes sense within that concept of things are happening for a reason. The tacked on scene, while I think it's exceptionally well constructed, that whole opening sequence in Paris, it doesn't really resonate with that in the same way.
I think this is one of the scenes where I could take either, because I remember enjoying the Paris scene.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think for me, what makes me lean towards the Lester Paris scene is, and it's a small detail, but the fact that a nuclear explosion tore apart the Phantom Zone, as opposed to, and it's not just that the Phantom Zone came by, it was a missile, this, probably about 15 feet wide, barreling through space, happens to hit this Phantom Zone, this, I don't know what it is, this dimension. And this piece of American hardware has, broken this whole dimension up, and they've escaped. And I think that is, for me, that would make me lean towards the Paris one. Also,
what makes you think it's American hardware?
It's American hardware. It is. It's 1970. Everything,
even though it's in Paris.
Well, no. Is it the nuclear missile was an American missile, wasn't it?
Yeah, but the first one. Yeah, but that's the first.
That's what I mean. That's the American hardware. The missile,
right? But that missile is written out of Superman, like the Lester version, the Paris version. They have a hydrogen bomb. They don't tell you where they got it. It's just these terrorists. They have a hydrogen bomb.
No, I'm talking about the missile is from the Donner.
Correct.
Yes. I'm saying the missile from the Donner. That's it. We're having a bit of a semantic conversation on the nuclear missile that broke it, whereas the Lester one wasn't a missile. It was an explosion from inside of an elevator. So that's where the main difference was.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That is certainly the difference.
Yeah.
But so you like the Paris version better then?
I lean towards the Paris version, but I could take or leave both. I think for me, I prefer having that scene. I don't, because the whole film franchise connects anyway. I don't need that obvious connection between, okay, this missile's up in the sky, hits the Phantom Zone, and we have this synchronicity now. I don't feel like that adds that much to it for me. But it's I'm splitting hairs between these.
I agree. I don't think that, because the Paris scene is a lot of fun, and I got to say, I don't know about you, the most fun thing about it, in a sense, is when he learns of what's going on in Paris, but he's still in Metropolis. I certainly pretended I was Superman a lot as a kid. I don't know if you did. And the sequence where he changes from Clark Kent to Superman by running down the alley and starting to rip his shirt, and then he just changes from clothes from one to the other.
Yeah.
I probably played that scene in my living room 10,000 times growing up. Right.
Well, the way they brought in the score too with that, I mean,
yeah, it's all very well done.
I think between those two, I think most people who like one or the other would agree that, yeah, I could take one or the other. So I think we can even say that that's a, you prefer one, I prefer the other. Let's say that's a draw, really, between those scenes.
I would agree, although I will say one thing about the Paris scene that, and again, this is being nitpicky and watching it for a show like we're doing right now, which I'd never done before. And I don't know that it ever would have occurred to me until if I hadn't been doing it this way. But I'm watching that the Superman 2 we got, the Richard Lester one, and Superman arrives in Paris. Isn't it funny that he knows exactly where to go? He without talking to anyone, without having any real, I mean, he left Metropolis. Obviously, some amount of time has elapsed. So he knows generally that there's a nuke at the Eiffel Tower. He does not know. They show that the elevator, the authorities in Paris have attempted to solve the situation by, blasting the elevator. That was a mistake because the elevator starts to drop and the bomb is now armed. He can't know that the bomb is armed. He can't know that it's on the elevator. He gets there. He stops the falling elevator. And Lois says, "Oh, there's a bomb," but she doesn't say, "Oh, it's on the elevator" or "it's armed," and she doesn't know that, frankly. And he just immediately lifts the elevator through the top of the Eiffel Tower and throws it out into space without asking a single question of anyone.
Yeah.
You know?
So really, he should have been surprised when it blew up in space. Like, oh shit.
Well, I guess not. I mean, I guess you could. I mean, you could start filling in like, well, Superman has X-ray vision, so he could use his X-ray vision to
And he could see
see in his arm. You know, but don't think too hard. They're Superman movies.
This is exactly the thing. I think I give the Superman franchise more grace in those sort of areas, because I thought the same thing. I was watching both cuts, and in each cut, I'm like, I could tear the shit out of both of these films, just like some of the crazy things that are going on. So,
and I mean, I think that it's exacerbated by the fact that it's done by two directors, right? Where each one, Richard Donner, when they're trying to assemble his cut well after the fact, they're stuck with the fact that obviously there were things he would have filmed but did not. So they got to throw in stuff from that Richard Lester did that doesn't really match his style or whatever, but they did it. And on the Richard Lester side, they got to throw in things that either make up for stuff because there were rules, right? There were things that they clearly reshot for no good reason other than he had to have, like, a certain percentage of the film as released had to have been directed. Like, he had to have been the director for, otherwise they, under Directors Guild of America rules, he could not be credited as the director.
Yeah.
So, you know, so.
Yep. Because it will just be, because the amount of content he had to be
correct,
responsible
exactly.
for.
They literally had to hit a certain percentage.
So why don't we move on to the next piece, which is, and if I miss anything in order, but I think the next major piece is Lois discovering how, who Clark Kent really is. I think is the next major differentiation between the two.
Oh,
people.
yes.
And I have, for me, this is an easy one, unlike the last one. Where do you see it?
Well, I will say that the screen.
Oh, by the way, hold on. Before you go, should we not highlight the difference first?
Oh, we should.
Let's frame it. So in the first one, essentially, Lois, and in both, Lois has an idea.
When
that
you
Clark
say the
is
first
Superman.
one, you're going to need to be more specific.
Sorry. So in the Lester version, and in the Donner version, both essentially Lois is getting switched on to the fact that Clark Kent is Superman. And in both versions, they have a very different way of going about it. Now, in the Donner version, Lois, as her first attempt to figure it out, decides, I'm going to jump out of the window of the Daily Planet, and you're here, Clark, so therefore Superman isn't going to let me die. And she jumps out, and then Clark Kent, in some sort of a clever way, manages to save her without giving away his identity. In the theatrical cut, the Lester cut, Lois, in Niagara, jumps into not into the falls, but jumps into the falls, down the falls, and Clark has to save her. And then in the Donner cut, the way it was unveiled, she actually shoots Clark with what seemingly is a gun. Clark, and then gives up that he's Superman, and it turns out she shot him with a blank. It was quite clever. And then in the Lester version, Superman, if you've ever seen it, has fallen into a fire. She realizes his hand's not burned. You're Superman, and Clark gives it up. So I just wanted to frame that for anybody who maybe hadn't watched it. And Andrew, what do you think?
I would say it's a little hard for me in that when you're watching the Donner cut version of this, they're actually assembling two different screen tests, the solo Christopher Reeve screen test, and then the Margot Kidder screen test, which they did once Christopher Reeve had already been cast. So he's in that. But in fact, if you look at the DVD set, you can see the same sequence with two or three other actresses. And I will say that Margot Kidder is far and away, when you watch them comparing 1-to-1, she clearly deserved the part. So good for Margot Kidder.
Yeah.
But, so you're looking at a screen test, you're looking at an unfinished product. It feels a little, it just doesn't feel polished and done. But I take the screenwriter's point, which is that because early in the Donner cut, the first sequence really in the Donner cut, one of the things about the Donner cut is because it's supposed to be, they were doing them at the same time. Superman 2 is really supposed to begin like the next day after Superman 1 ends. And Lois is now putting it together. And at the very outset of the film, she throws herself out a window to challenge Clark. She's like, I think this is how sure I am that you're Superman. You won't let me die. And she throws herself out a window. And then, so the screenwriter makes the argument, see, that then resonates in their version of the scene when she says, I risked my life. That was my mistake the first time. This time I'm going to risk yours, when she pulls out the gun. And then, of course, it turns out it was loaded with blanks. So in general, I agree with the screenwriter that is a better construction. Because it's not completely done, it's hard to say. I would almost call it a draw, but I do like the way that the Donner version is written slightly better if it had been completed. So I guess if pushed on it, I would go with the Donner version.
I would for me, it's an obvious Lester version.
Okay.
I'm quite, so my issue with the Donner version is I think it's quite contrived, and I think it doesn't flow very well. So the first scene, she's looking at a newspaper, and I like the elements in the Donner version, but I don't like the way it works in with the story. So she sees Clark's really shitty disguise of a pair of glasses, finally figures it out using a marker and a newspaper. I have no problem with that. But then she decides, I'm going to risk my life and jump out of the window of the Daily Planet. And I have all sorts of problems with that. I just think it's like really immature. It's really like a childish solution to what is a really good reporter, really intelligent person.
Yes.
Whereas if you compare it to the Niagara Falls version, I can buy her jumping into the river more than I can having her jump out of the window of the Daily Planet. And the way that Clark Kent deals with both of those situations, the Lester version is much more, I think, is more clever in how he is able to save her and not look like Superman. Whereas the whole process of running down the stairs, and what he does is he blows to slow down her descent, uses his X-ray vision, which somebody on the street looks at, actually reacts to the X-ray or whatever.
Sorry, a good point. I missed that.
So if you watch it, because when he shoots his I don't know what to call it, but when he shoots his
heat vision,
heat vision at a it was an overhang. I don't know what they call it, marquee awning. Yeah. It opens up, and then Lois hits it and falls on a fruit stand. And for me, that it almost seemed like, fuck, how are we going to make this work if she's going to jump out of the window? Run downstairs, use his breath, use his eyes, and she'll be fine. Whereas the scene with Niagara, he's running alongside trying to save her. He looks obviously like, I'm not going to jump in to save her. I'm not Superman. And he uses his vision to get a log down, and he jumps in to save her. To me, it just seemed like a much more mature and more plausible way to go through that process.
You could talk me into your point of view, and I'll tell you why. I mean, Mankiewicz, when you listen to the DVD commentary on the Donner cut, is very enamored of his solution to this, how the scenes come together. I agree with you, though. He really thinks that this is an impressive opening to the film, that Lois' first thing is she throws herself out a window to make a point. And I agree. I don't think that's nearly as convincing as he seems to think it is. I do think if they had been able to complete the sort of payoff on that scene where she's like, wait a minute, my problem was I risked my life, I ought to risk yours. That scene probably would have worked better, because in the Lester version, she figures it out. Like he goes to all that trouble, and then like a minute later, he just trips and puts his hand in the fire, and he doesn't even really try to explain it away. He starts, and then he's like, forget it. You're right, I am. And like that felt like weak to me.
Well, the only reason I let that pass, because my issue with that, because that's not without fault, because what I would say is I would like a combination of the two, because I thought the blank in the gun was quite a clever little scene. I liked how they did that. And I think they could have done something sort of a hybrid between the two, but they covered it through sort of the dialogue where she says, maybe you wanted to tell
they're making it like a psychological thing.
Like he's subconsciously being a dickhead about this. But for me, it's when I look at those two side by side, and I look at the flow of the film and how it unfolded, it sort of unfolded rather naturally and progressively in the Lester version. Whereas I'm not clear in the Donner version if how convinced she is after she falls into the fruit stand that that's Superman. And it for me, there's I have trouble buying it, and part of it may be because it's incomplete. But just conceptually, the way that the Lester version works for me, it just seems like it fits so much better into the plot.
I think you might be talking me into your point of view on this, because as I'm thinking about it, one of the things that I mean, both films are going for Superman, the original, and then both versions of Superman 2. But I think because the Lester version is the complete version, I think it comes across perhaps a little bit better.
I think that's fair.
Is the idea that what fools Lois about Clark Kent versus Superman is not the goofy pair of glasses and the hat, because that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And everybody knows it is. It's not the physical disguise. It is the psychological disguise.
It's the nerviness. It's the nerdiness, the unsureness. And I think Christopher Reeve does an incredible job with that.
He does. And I think you might be right that the payoff in the Lester, which I initially thought of as like, well, tripping on a rug and putting your hand in the fire. I wish it would have been a little bit, because to me, like, if you're committed to it, people have accidentally gotten their hands in a fire and come away. You know what I mean? Like, stranger things have happened.
Yeah. Oh, it looked like it was in the fire. Actually, it was bent, and I just didn't have it in there. It looked like I was burnt. Honestly, I'm fine. I'm more scared than anything else.
He could have talked his way out of that without a problem if he's a committed liar, which he has been apparently for his entire life. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's not.
they could have. I think the perfect ending to that would have been to have him fall in the fire. He does a shitty job of covering it up. Then Lois gets out the gun. For me, that would be a clever way to do it. But
the thing is that what you were starting to talk me into is the notion that what she says to him is, well, maybe you wanted to, that it is that. If you're going to get into the psychology of it, that there's conscious and there's subconscious.
Yeah.
And he may be consciously trying, and of course he is, to play this dual role, this duality out, but that there's something subconsciously, I don't know, that does suddenly seem, as you talk, to kind of, you know what? I've changed my mind. I think you're right. I agree. Yes.
I think when I look at the whole disguise piece, and I was listening to other people who've made YouTube videos on this, talking about how, and I do like the idea of her taking the newspaper with the permanent marker and coloring it in. I thought, that
worked.
But it's where for me, it's how long has she been working with him at that point? And how long she spent like a whole evening flying around with Superman in the first one as well.
Yes.
And I think, when she saw him in Niagara Falls cleaning his glasses, I mean, at that point, I think that was the point when it starts to change over. But from there, I think the scenes I don't think there's a major difference, but again, I think you're 50-50. I may be leaning towards Lester on that.
I think you've kind of talked me into that is a better. Actually, it does work a little bit better, and it does feel like in what they released, it feels appropriate because it also works. I don't know that Lois jumping into the water would be any more mature than her jumping out of a building, in one sense, except that not a few minutes before we have seen Superman come and save a little boy who fell from a much greater height.
There's a little bit more evidence there for her.
Right, so that she can kind of that does sort of work a little bit better, and there's more build up to the moment.
So my logical mind and everything, my logical mind looks at her jumping out of a window and just thinking about this. If I was in her position, now I'm over, analyzing this, but just for the sake of this conversation, her jumping out of the building, that's like it. She's got about 3 seconds to be right or wrong, whereas she doesn't jump out of it. I paid attention to this because I literally watched one scene, then the other, then one scene, then the other. She jumps, 15 feet into a dangerous rapid. So there's an element where she expects to survive the fall, and she has now time to be saved. And for me, that's like, if we're going to really break this down, that's where that maybe sort of crack in the armor for me started to show when I compare those two.
There's also one crack, which again, this comes from watching it for an analysis purpose. Never occurred to me before. Wouldn't have occurred to me, I don't think, this time if I hadn't been thinking in these terms. He doesn't want to get in the water, doesn't want to reveal the secret. Very good. Okay. So he uses his heat vision to separate a log and have it fall in rapid water. That, like, he has no control over whether that's going to work or not. He does one log. it could have immediately gone like, the complete
It
wrong direction.
works.
And then what? He's going to watch her drown,
I think at that stage it was like, all right, if this doesn't work, I may need to put on the red and blue. At that stage, I think he's got to make that decision. So I think we move on to the next piece.
Well, wait, before we move on, I need 30 seconds here.
Yes.
Because one thing that they cut from the Donner version, because it is extremely Richard Lester, so I get why they cut it. He had nothing to do with this, but it is an amazing little 30-second vignette. The guy who is the little concierge or butler or bellboy who brings them up, bellhop, brings them up to there, and he shows them around the hotel, looks at the car. This part is in the Donner version because they couldn't cut it for continuity purposes. They needed to have at least this much in, where he says, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And because it's about a society that's no longer with us, where people would pretend to be married so they could go, register at a hotel together and all that. Yeah. Right. But and then his whole attitude walking through there is just amazing. It's so well done.
Well, and I think this is where we start. And before I go to the next, because I think the next big piece is his Fortress of Solitude. Did I say that right?
Yes, the Fortress.
Before I go to that, though, there was one scene, and maybe this is a Lester thing, but this is where I started to maybe lean towards Lester. And it was the scene where Zod and I never remember the other two names, land in the water. And
yes,
the way Donner did this, and you may be able to help me out this, it was a bit more, on and up, and they kind of move forward into the town. I really like the scene, and this is from what I understand, very Lester thing, where she burns the snake. She picks up a snake, it bites her, she throws it on the ground and discovers she's got heat vision. And then the stupid one picks it up and then tries to use the heat vision, and it doesn't work. And it was such a cute little scene. And that was something that was and for me, just the way that unfolded, I actually found I missed that when I watched the Donner scene. I'm like, oh, where's the thing where he's picking up the snake and figures out he can't? Because later in the film, actually, why don't we talk about this? Because we're on it next. That whole scene in the town, because that was actually more different than I expected it to be. When we go to the town, then it connects this clever little joke where he uses his heat vision to blow up. I think it was like a car or something. He looks at Zod for approval, and Zod just sort of goes, like this idiot. And I thought that was a clever scene. For me, it added so much value with that little setup at the beginning. And that was something that I think Lester was superior at, with these sort of subtle little jokes. And I read that the cast enjoyed that bit of humor to the film. And I think superhero films, a lot of them, I think they benefit from those little interludes of humor.
I mean, you are seeing a very different style start to unfold.
Yeah.
And remember, Lester filmed all of that. All that stuff was filmed by Lester. So what winds up in the Donner version is basically what was required to make the movie hang together.
Yeah.
But Donner talks about how he had a vision that the villains, Zod, Ursula, Ursula, I think, and Non, I think is the
Non, that's it.
Yeah. That they be real threats, that they be menacing. And as much as Terrence Stamp's performance as Zod is amazing,
it is very good.
It's my favorite thing in the whole film, honestly. Either version, it's in prison, both when they're in the diner and Superman has the encounter. Well, he's not Superman anymore, and he has the encounter with that bully at the truck stop or whatever. And then they, after the fight's over, they're looking up at the TV, and that's when he learns that Zod and his pals have been on Earth this whole time. And Zod, the president starts to say, like, listen, I've in order to blah, 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 he's announcing, I'm bending the knee. I'm doing what I need to do. And he then starts to say, oh, Superman, can you hear me? Can you hear? Grab like, please help. And Zod comes and grabs the microphone and says, who is this Superman? Who are you? Come kneel before me. Show yourself. Kneel before Zod. And then the best part is there's like this 2-second beat where he's just staring at the camera, and then he just screams Zod one more time for no reason. And it gets me every time. Zod!
I need to go back and watch that again.
Oh, it's brilliant. But Terrence Stamp's performance is amazing. But you are seeing a divergence right in these sequences between because Donner has it in his mind, so he says, that he wants these people to be very serious threats to Superman in a way that Lex Luthor, who is the jokey kind of person, and in fact, a lot of what's interesting is if you watch the Donner cut, there's a lot more footage of Lex Luthor in the Donner cut than there is in, and a lot of his lines are jokes that are removed by a guy who liked jokiness. But again, I think that they were shooting for percentage. So like,
can I jump in on that really quick?
Sure,
just really quick, because I have an example. Sorry, because this was well before the scene. There was one obvious joke that really to me stood out that Lester removed in the prison. And it's a subtle one. And the only reason I saw it is I watched one then the other, and I just happened to pick up on it. And he said something about alpha waves or the black box. And Otis was like, I think he said, oh, yeah, that's it. And he made a comment about chicken or something in the Donner. It was like a really stupid joke about, I really like chicken. If it was about chicken, you'd understand. And Lester removed that. And to me, it just looked like that joke was something that any director would have pulled from the film. And I don't think it's fair to judge Donner on that, because he may well have pulled that ultimately, but there was an obvious to me difference in the way Donner would deliver a joke versus Lester. Lester was more physical and facial expressions.
Oh yeah.
And Donner was very verbal and very more overt, very obvious in how he delivered some of that.
I mean, I will say this for Donner in general, especially if you watch the first film, he and his team took the material very seriously. And you have to keep in mind, this movie's coming out in the late 70s. You're only not even quite a decade removed, or I guess maybe by now you are about a decade removed from the end of the Batman TV show, that was so campy. And comic books were thought of as this silly kid stuff, so that you could either do it as a Saturday morning cartoon show on a very rudimentary level for little kids, or you could do it for adults as sort of like tongue-in-cheek, ha ha ha, isn't this all hilarious? And he's trying to create a Superman film that still has a lightness to it, that's not overly serious, but that it can be taken seriously by an adult audience. And he was trying to continue that by making these villains serious threats. Lester was English, and England, comic books were never a thing they were here in America. The notion of a superhero. I mean, now it's, 50 years on, so I'm sure a lot of these characters, the cultures have intermingled, and there's probably more appreciation for this, but comic books are if you want to call it an art form, they are one of your few originally rarely American art forms. And it's a very American concept. And Lester grew up without it. And so he, I think, saw the whole thing as kind of goofy and silly. And he was a goofy, silly kind of guy himself. So he brought this sort of goofy, silly aesthetic, and therefore he doesn't care about internal, like if you're talking about, as you were earlier in this, internal consistent logic, he doesn't care about that at all. And you can see that in the final version of Superman 2. It's all over the place. But the scene that you just mentioned would be one. You pointed to where Non picks up the stick, and the joke is like he watched Ursa do this and then he can't. Ha ha ha. Okay. Because he's a big dummy. On the other hand, if you think about it for even 1 second, if a snake bites Superman, what happens to Superman? Not a thing. Does he even feel it? The snake's teeth probably break, right? Why does she react the way she does? Why does it hurt her? She then throws it down. Makes no internal sense at all.
I think, though, there's multiple times where Superman, though, I would say that that's an inconsistent piece with Superman in general. Just even him. There's times where he gets injured in things like he looks like he's hurting for things that he shouldn't be hurt doing. But that is, I think, for me, I didn't pick up on that. I think that's a fair point to raise with Ursula.
Yes, and I mean, you see that as the film progresses, especially in the ending sequence of Superman 2, which we'll get to. Remind me of the Richard Lester, the theatrically released version. The ending sequence of the stuff that Lester shot makes literally no sense, and it's just there for his somewhat goofy aesthetic.
So, well, we have, and the one thing I wanted to highlight, and it's not necessarily a major difference, but the way they cut together the fight sequence with the town, even the way they brought into play the sheriff and the deputy in the Lester version, I watched those side by side. There's actually quite a bit of difference in that setup. The Donner version didn't have any of the bit where, you know, the gun was thrown under the police car. They're quite fascinated with it. Non goes, lifts up the car, picks it up, drops it down. And the reason this to me was an important piece, because the next scene is the police officer and the deputy and the sheriff rolling into town looking at their damaged car. And for me, the Lester version had a really nice flow with the storyline into how the conflagration in the town came about. In the Donner version, it just happens, and there's no real context for it.
I agree.
And I think this is where, for me, I'm starting to see a more skilled director in Lester than that of Donner. This is where my brain is going.
Well, I would object to that on this point, that all of that sequence, all of it, was filmed by Lester, and the whole point of the Richard Donner cut was to maximize. And they have the same rules, right? If you're going to call it the Richard Donner cut, you got to have a film that's more than 50% shot by Richard Donner. So it's now the same process in reverse. They're being very selective in what they choose to use out of stuff that was exclusively shot by Lester, because they're trying to go for a different tone. So they're going to cut out all the little Lester-y jokes. And the Lester jokes are, you know, once you know who Richard Lester is, like, and obviously he directed A Hard Day's Night, you know, and so if you're familiar with those kinds of people, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just the question is, does it fit Superman or not, or does it fit what Donner wanted to do? Clearly, it doesn't fit what Donner wanted to do. So they are going to excise anything that doesn't really work with what Donner's doing, and they want something lean. They want something that's going to be as much Donner as possible. So in sequences that are entirely shot by Lester, they got to just pick just enough to make continuity hang together and then move on. But so I agree. It doesn't really work in the Donner version because it happens too fast and you're like, why are they there? What's going on? I totally agree with that. But I think that's a limitation of the fact that obviously if Donner had come back and shot the film as was originally intended, he would have shot his own set of sequences.
But for me, what I start questioning when I was looking into this is the Donner outcome a situation of him not being organized enough in filmmaking, in management of time, in management of budget. Because there's one interview, and I think what's that?
I said, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But I think that goes down. You have to take that into account when you're making a film. If you haven't organized your time to the point that you can't create the piece of work that you wanted to, is that your fault of the producers? Because Lester came in with more constraints and less budget and was able to get his storyline across, though it has faults. And this is where I see, because what bothered me is when I look at the collection, if I remove the Lester additions to the town siege scene, and from the point they come into town to the point that they're at the White House, and even like the Donner bit had the bit where they carve their faces into Mount Rushmore, which I thought was that
from the Donner version.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Instead, they topple the Washington Monument in the Donner version.
Yeah, the Donner version had the Mount Rushmore piece, not the Lester version.
The Lester version has the Mount Rushmore piece.
Well, I don't know about that.
Pretty sure.
We'll have to check that out. But
I'm pretty sure. In fact, I can tell you that the Donner, one of the things that they never filmed for the Donner piece, and I think this is why they show you the Washington Monument being toppled.
Oh yeah, because the reverse in time piece that goes back up.
There's the reversing time, but also that was just one little sliver. Like originally, what they had written was that they were going to show, and this is pursuant to the idea of these bad guys being true, global, terrific physical threats to Superman, is that they were going to show a whole sequence of them running around and defacing famous world, top of the Washington Monument. I think if you go to Superman 3, there's a point when he's evil Superman, without getting into the details of that film, where he, in a drunken sort of, he's evil, drunk, and feeling nasty. So to be a prick, basically, he takes the Leaning Tower of Pisa and pushes it up. Right? Yeah. Well, that was originally thought conceived of for Superman 2, for those villains to do. but they never got around to filming it. And then I guess they liked it, so they wound up sticking it in Superman 3.
Well, and I think where we may differ. So for me, it was a big thing for me. This is where the I started to shift towards Lester. That whole process, like the film, I rewatched both of those films from landing in town, Houston, to White House, and it just was, for me, starkly different. And for me, that's where I started to lean towards Lester, that series of scenes.
I mean, here's what I would say. To me, there's two separate, distinct questions that have now been introduced. One is, which is better, the Superman 2, what we got, or Superman 2 Richard Donner cut?
Yes.
And then there is the question of who's a better director, Richard Lester or Richard Donner. I think I could have the answer that I probably prefer what they were going to do. And of course, the Superman 2 Richard Donner cut is never really going to be, because they just didn't do enough of it. It's only kind of like a sketch of what they were shooting for. I probably think that winds up being a more consistent Superman film with the first film on the whole than what we actually got. But do I think that Richard Donner is a better director than Richard Lester? I think Richard Lester may in fact be a better director than Richard Donner. But partly, I mean, just from a business perspective, he clearly, as you pointed out, because Donner was given like basically a blank. He didn't think in terms of
he didn't think he had a budget.
Yeah,
somebody asked. I read an interview where somebody asked him about his budget, and he's like, "I haven't been given a budget." So the only people that ever say that are the people that should have the budget, given the budget.
Precisely.
But so let's because just to make sure we're getting through, there's a few other points that maybe we should cover, and one of which I wanted to get your opinion on was the Fortress of Solitude scenes and how he loses his power and gets it back. And I think the question is down to Marlon Brando or his mother, and there's two very different ways.
Marlon Brando all the way.
I'm the other way. So for me, the Marlon Brando scene, I struggle with the different, either with Lex Luthor there or with Superman there. Like the whole scene where Lois, so for me, here's where I struggle. And I'm just going to compare these quickly. Lois wants to learn more about him. In the Donner version, she goes straight to boning him and then sees him losing his powers. which really, Superman losing his powers is the equivalent of like a teenager getting his girlfriend's tattoo on his ass. Because he's making a decision that his dad's saying, you can't go back if you do this. If you tattoo this name on your ass, you're stuck with this tattoo on your ass. Mm-hmm. And that's what he does. He pretty much loses his powers. And the way that conflagrates in the Donner version is just like shit happens and then he doesn't have powers. In the Lester version, she's learning about the space, learning about Superman, and then they naturally bone. And to me, I'm okay with that. And then when we take a look at the
you notice that the biggest difference is that in the Lester version, they don't bone until
they do, don't they?
No, they do, but not until after he has given up his powers. In the Donner version, they do it before he gives up his powers, which does sort of. I mean, there's a lot of logical questions there. I mean, like first and foremost, why does he have to give up his powers? Well, if the answer is if you want to, if you want to do the horizontal hokey pokey, first and foremost, on a purely physical level, you're going to have to change your molecular structure in order. That would make a certain amount of like internal sense. And so Lester's version on that level makes more sense. Like if he could do it without having to give up the powers, then why does he have to give up the powers?
However, the Marlon Brando bit was good. That was the one bit about the Marlon Brando bit that was good.
See, there's no explanation with. I understand they had to re-record the dialogue without Marlon Brando. That has to do with salaries and money, and okay, it's business. But why didn't you give the same dialogue and explanation? The mom is just more like, well, if you're going to do this, then if you're going to live with one of them, then you have to be one of them, and it's like one sentence. But like Marlon Brando kind of walks him through it. It says like, well, if this is what you want, then it follows this. But think about what you're giving up. Think about, he starts with the whole reasoning of the dedication of your life to one person is mutually exclusive to the idea that you're going to dedicate your life to all people.
Yeah. He essentially says, why are you being a selfish prick? Correct. Aren't there other people out there? And my issue with that scene isn't Marlon Brando as such, although his floating hologram annoys me throughout the whole thing. It's a big head here. It's a stand-up person here. It's a massive giant here. And it's just like there's no rhyme or reason to it. But that scene, that's the best piece with Marlon Brando. But then Clark Kent, and I think part of it, and I saw somebody mention this, and I thought it was a really good point. This was early doors they were filming when Christopher Reeve was getting his Superman chops down, his Clark Kent chops down. And the acting in that scene with Clark Kent, he sounds like a petulant child when he's like, I wanna continue boning her, and I don't give a shit about all these people. Now,
Correct.
I think the scene is all right, but for me, the hologram and the explanation does help, but I never questioned that whole logic. And for me, just the simple fact, it's stupid. I appreciate this, but the simple fact that they had like a television set up with the crystal, it was a consistent thing, and the mother, he was like, for me, it just worked better than having this floating hologram.
She
everywhere
becomes a body too.
Does she?
She does.
When? She's always in the crystal in that one. Always.
Well, you see now, I'm starting to question. I was surprised to see it where she comes out and is a body, and I'm like, wait a minute, do I have an extended version?
Is this when he gets his power back? No, I don't know.
No, this is when he gives it up and she walks out. And I remember, like, I just watched it last night.
Oh, is that when he goes into the thing and she walks out and
yeah, and she's hanging out. So she does the same thing. That's what I don't think that. I will grant you that Christopher, part of the problem, even with the way it was filmed in the Donner version, is that suddenly he's reverting, yes, to like a lovesick teenager. He's like a 32-year-old man. And like he's like, yeah, well, I love her again.
That's what it was, though.
Having said that, I mean, the whole arc, and this is true. I mean, the whole arc of the story changes with Marlon Brando in part 2 as opposed to the mom, because it's a consistent narrative. If you watch part 1, there's no secret, right, that some of what's going on especially the way they built the first Superman film is that they were paralleling Superman, and it's an obvious parallel to the Christ narrative, right? You're sent here by a godlike figure to come, and they're great people, Kal-El. They can be great, but they only lack the light to show the way. You're that light. You know what I mean? You're here. You're on a messianic mission for these people. And rather like the Martin Scorsese film from the Nikos Kazantzakis book, The Last Temptation of Christ, what would be the temptation of anybody so burdened? It would be like, why do I got to give my entire life up? And anything that I might want to shepherd the people. Like maybe I just want to live like a regular human being for once, And so it's all this like, Christology kind of religious allegory narrative. And it pays off with Marlon Brando there in part 2, because it's the temptation of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? It's like, Father, please take this cup away from me. It's that whole concept. When you switch it out for the mother, I mean, that could be done well. I don't think it's done especially well, for one thing. And for another thing, it doesn't resonate with anything that came in the previous film. So, and of course, they weren't planning on that. So whatever, it just doesn't quite work for me. Not once you see the way it worked fine when I didn't know. Now that I know, it doesn't work anymore.
I think what it was for me, it was a more logical path for him to go into this crystal and then have his powers taken away in this thing, as opposed to this like light show that happens and he loses his power with him interacting with his father. And the only thing I would say that probably made it okay was the fact that if you talk about, listen, I want to spend the rest of my life with this woman, you're probably not going to talk to your dad about it. You're probably going to talk to your mother about it, if we're being consistent in that regard. But that's we're sort of picking hairs here, because for me, and this is something maybe, and I didn't know, this is what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, but if you have that relationship, think about this though. If you have that relationship where you're like, gee, I want this. I know I better not go ask dad. I'll ask mom. What's mom going to say? Well, I'll talk to your father. You know what I mean?
This is a modern film in that regard. The women are very powerful here. But the I think that sets up more obviously, and this is something maybe I missed, and this is what I wasn't sure about. When he does the switcheroo on the old crystal, the crystal cave thing, when he retains his power and Zod loses his power. How is that explained in the Donner version? Because it's set up by him losing his powers in the Lester version.
Well, it's the same explanation, that he somehow reversed the chamber so that the chamber becomes...
Was he in the chamber in the Donner one?
Yeah, I mean,
Or was he just standing there and it was a big light show and all of a sudden
there's some kind of like little. It's not as obvious of a chamber, I grant you. Like they refilmed that to make the chamber look very, very obvious, which is fine. I mean, I think that it's a little bit more subtle, but he's in some kind of partitioned off area, for lack of a better term.
So why don't we, as time's getting on here, why don't we shuttle along to the end of the film, because this is something that you did want to address. And for me, I think I'm going to be very succinct with my view. I can live with the kiss, because that scene, actually, if you look at that scene,
I wasn't there yet. I was going to talk about the ending sequence, which is problematic in both versions. It doesn't, once again, but Superman. So they have the big fight in Metropolis, and it's roughly the same in both films. There's some small differences.
I think the Donner one has better fight scenes than the Lester one. I'll grant it that.
Well, Lester one's filled with these little jokes that they're cut out of the Donner one, which I think again is an improvement, because again, if you want Zod and these folks to be taken seriously, there's I think the quintessential Lester joke is that they're blowing, as the Metropolites think that Superman's been killed, so it's almost kind of poignant. They know that that these people are not people that anybody can just go up and fight and expect to win, and yet there's this kind of look, this was our guy that you did this to. And there's a kind of poignancy to the notion that we might lose, but we're going to try. As many of us as can do this and get together, grab anything you can, we're going to go after these people.
Yeah.
And then Zod just sort of, with this kind of aplomb, bored almost, I'm not even going to touch you. I'm just going to, and that's all very poignant. And then it's sort of undermined by in the Lester version, there's all kinds of little gags about people's wigs blowing off and the one guy's on
falling
the phone.
down, reading a paper.
Yeah. And it's okay. I mean, that's funny enough.
I think that's
in
fair.
One context, but it kind of it depends. Or you want this to be serious, or do you want this just to be sort of a ha ha ha? And
then at this point in the film, it's not the right time.
It's not. And then they go back up to, so Superman realizes he's got to draw them out of Metropolis because this is the problem, which is smart, right? And I credit the film, either version, for he never says it out loud. He never says, I think in a modern film, you have to have him say or have a voiceover or some kind of thing where someone would say, oh, I see why he went up to the Fortress of Solitude, to draw them away from...
Yeah.
But you just have to put that together as the audience.
I think both films. That's quite clever. I realized when I watched that again, I thought that's for a superhero film. That was a really good way to wrap up that fight with the bad guys. I thought it was really well done.
And so then they get up there, and then of course there's a bunch of stuff that they and I think this was again just done. There's no reason to re-record what was done at the end of the Donner film. You could just have rolled with it. But I think this had to do either with Lester's preferences or just the fact that they needed to get a certain amount of the percentage of the film be directed by Lester. In the Lester version, Lex Luthor is dropped off because Gene Hackman didn't come back. So you see him only from behind. If you listen carefully, you can tell it's clearly not actually Gene. Yeah, right. Yeah. And then they have a fight amongst themselves. And it's this thing where they are standing here and they disappear and they appear over there. And Superman's standing here and he disappears. And at one point he says to Lois, we used to play this game in school all the time. I never was any good at it, which is kind of funny, in a sort of just a non sequitur sort of thing. But on the other hand, what the hell is he talking about? He clearly didn't play that in any school he went to on Earth, and Krypton blew up when he was a baby, where he never went to school. So it's what on earth? You talked about at the front end of this internal logic. Those are the kinds of things that I think people get annoyed with Richard Lester about. He was more interested in telling his little gags than he was about the internal consistency of the character or the story, which I don't think he took seriously. I think he looked at it as, this is just kids' comic book, so who cares? And that was definitely not the Richard Donner approach. Love it or hate it, he came at it as yes, this is kids material, but this is stuff. I'm an American. He's at the time he's going to be 90, but in 1970 he was 40. So a lot of kids, he was born in 1930. He probably grew up reading Superman comics, and so. On the one hand, he probably recognized, a lot of 40-year-olds at the time, sure, this is childish, it's stuff I did as a kid, but it's still part of, I take it seriously on some level because Superman is the hero we all want to be. I mean, what Superman basically at the bottom line is the notion that any one of us running around, we all have our weaknesses, our failings. The girl that we want doesn't like us. The bully beats us up at school, and it's the imagination that every kid has. If only they knew. Like, I may look like this dweeb or whatever, but in reality, I'm Superman, right? And he took that whole element seriously, start to finish, and he wanted to take it seriously, start to finish. And I think that's why fans prefer, and I think correctly, Richard Donner.
I don't think there's that much of a drop off between those two in that element. Really, I really don't. And I can see that there's those few little picadillos in the film, but I can pick quite a few with the Donner version that maybe don't necessarily represent the brand of Superman.
Oh, sure.
Now, I think you make a good point that I think Donner has a lot more, I don't know, buy into the franchise as a filmmaker. But there's some, after watching this, I think there is logic behind having somebody who's making a more serious film. And when I say serious film, I don't mean necessarily serious. Who, it almost adds a bit of credibility to the franchise for not just fans of the film, but fans of film. And I think Lester brings a bit of balance to the franchise, and it left me wondering because the end scenes. When we look at those end scenes, the backward in time thing, the fact that Donner, if I was Donner, and we were re-releasing this film, I would be embarrassed to play I'm going to use the backwards in time thing again. I would be embarrassed to use that.
I think it was the biggest mistake.
But to me, I'm just amazed that was the way it went forward. And even if I were to break down that scene where the kiss was stupid, but there's a lot of things that and we didn't even talk about the cellophane-esque. That was just ridiculous in itself. And that was very much
Richard Lester gag.
Yeah, it is a list, and that is a mistake. But I think the cellophane-esque is a lot less offensive than the time reversal piece. It's why doesn't Superman just do that every time? It just bothers me. But even if you look at that last scene where he does that kiss, and the acting between Christopher Reeve and Lois Lane, Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder, it's actually very good, the acting, and some of the dialogue isn't that bad. If you just suspend your sort of Superman franchise views, it's not a bad scene. So for me, like, I was left wondering, I wonder what Superman 1 would have been had it been directed by Richard Lester. Because I think had he had time and he had the spec, I think he might have done a better. This is going to be very controversial in Superman circles. I don't give a fuck. I think Superman 1 would have potentially been better with Lester.
Wow. I don't think I can follow you there, Sean. I mean,
No.
Superman.
I'm throwing myself into the cauldron. That's my view. I'm going to hold
Richard Lester had his shot to do a full Superman movie start to finish, and it was Superman 3. And he turned it into a Richard Pryor movie. And Superman 3 is very interesting in its own right because it's a slice of 1983. Richard Pryor is at the absolute apex of his Richard Pryorness. And Richard Lester having, Superman 2 was a big financial success. The Salkins looked at him as basically the savior because he came in, got it done under budget, all the businessy things that you'd be worried about, right? So then they gave him the reins, like, here, do Superman 3. And he came and he did Superman 3. And Superman 3, I mean, we could do a show about that movie sometime because it's it's a fascinating movie. It really is. I could watch it many, many times. I went for a period when I was, I watched it a bunch when I was a kid, and then I didn't for many years. And I remember one time I was like, I think I got it at Hollywood Video when they were going out of business. I bought their VHS cassette and I said, Anna, I was dating my wife at the time. I was like, let's go back to my house and watch this Superman 3. I seem to remember it's sort of a goofy kind of thing. And then for the first hour or so, I'm like, well, this movie's not so bad. It's pretty good, actually. It's got some silliness to it, but it's not overly so. It seems pretty good. And then it just it doesn't really hang together much in the back half. But anyway, it's an extremely different take on the character. And you see what Richard Lester, where he is and what he would have done. Yeah. The first Superman film, I think, is about as good to this day. I think it's the best superhero film ever done.
I don't agree with that. My issue with Superman. So my issue with the first one is, and I like the film. I'm not saying I don't like the film. I very much do like the film. And before I went into 2, I would have said I liked 1 before 2 before we watched this again because I hadn't watched 2 in a long time. But I think the problem with one, and maybe it stems to my aversion to time travel, Superman, but it's the fact that he's fighting, this natural series of events with fault lines and earthquakes, and he's doing these things that, like, I don't feel like they flow well, or it's almost too hard to suspend. Like, he's got these powers and the speed that he's moving and the way he's moving from one conflict to another, and they're focusing on just the ones that he's addressing. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like a very smooth series of events that to me, like, I just have a lot of questions as far as what's going on. And then all of a sudden he goes back in time and they're all fixed.
Well, see, I think the one mistake that they made was having Lois Lane die at the end of that film.
Yeah.
So that he then had to turn back the clock, because then that undoes a lot of the logic of the film. And again, I did not learn until we were doing this that was not supposed to be the ending of Superman 1. It was supposed to be the ending of It was supposed to be the ending of Superman 2. Lois is supposed to die, originally conceived to be killed by the bad guys at the end of Superman 2. I don't like the whole, I mean, I agree, it's the weakest story element, no matter where you stick it, no matter how you think of it. I mean, I understand why they were enamored of, because what I will say this about the Richard Donner cut, the interesting thing, if there is an interesting thing about turning the world backwards, was seeing on the ground things like what it looked like to be on the ground as the world went backwards, not from the point of view of just running film backwards of a dam busting, but like of watching Perry White, his toothpaste go back in the tube.
Oh, yeah.
The
thing that jumped out at me at that scene is he's brushing his teeth with a cigar in his mouth.
Yes.
He's actually got a cigar in his mouth, and he's like he doesn't take it out at any point.
Yeah.
Talking about, before we wrap up here, there's one inconsistency. I wanted to get one inconsistency. I've always wanted to share this with somebody.
Yeah.
In Superman 1, and it's something that always bothered me. And it was my favorite thing and least favorite thing in the first film, and that is the hideout for Lex Luthor. So that underground next to the subway hideout that he has.
It's a closed train station.
Yeah, I think that's a cool idea. I just remember I can't get out of my head the amount of contractors he had to get involved on that thing to get that place looking the standard it was and keep it a secret.
It is silly.
It is like opulent. It is killer. And he found a way to, I mean, he's Lex Luthor, of course, he can do that.
Right.
But he found a way to do that without spilling the beans that it was there.
It's really, really silly, but if you think about it at all. But no, it's a really cool, because I think what it was based on was like Grand Central Station and Penn Station, right? Yeah. Those were train stations, because they were like Penn Station. I'm trying to remember. I learned about this in college. I believe it was Grand Central Station in New York that they closed, and they closed it so they could like sublimate it. Like they ended up running it underground, and so like it, they took away, it had originally been built as this big, beautiful, opulent thing, and and they wound up turning into like this 70s sort of like dark underground train station with ceiling tiles and, kind of ugly and hideous. And then at some point they got the money together in New York to rehabilitate the real Grand Central Station. There was like a similar thing to do with like New York Penn Station. They were going to buy the post office across the street, because that building had been built at the same time. The original Penn Station building had been destroyed. Anyway, I think that's what it was, the 70s, that like the nadir. I mean, that movie came out in 78, and that was like the absolute nadir for cities in America. Like in the 1970s, cities were bad. And I think that they were kind of playing on the notion that like, there was at one time this beautiful Grand Central Station, and that, Lex Luthor is occupying. I will say one other thing about you mentioned that what you found tough about the first Superman film, and I think that's why Lex Luthor is in fact the perfect villain for Superman. And it's always the problem if you're having to write Superman, right, is that he, you need a conflict, but he's like this all-powerful god. Yeah. And so how do you write? It's a real challenge for a writer. But like in the 90s, one thing that they did, like the 70s, I'm not exactly sure how Lex Luthor was being portrayed in the comic books. They did what they did in the film, which is Gene Hackman puts in a very memorable performance. In the 90s, and specifically, you remember that there was Batman the Animated Series, then they did a Superman the Animated Series cartoon. For that Superman the Animated Series cartoon, I think they were taking this from the comic book. They really kind of reconfigured the Lex Luthor character to be basically like the CEO of a multinational corporation.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you said at the beginning of this, that he can't punch his way out. That's exactly what makes the conflict, is that you present, here's a hero who can punch his way through, out and out of and into any physical situation you can name, but you put him up against an adversary who cannot be fought that way. That's interesting. You know what I mean? And I think that is why Lex Luthor works.
I would say that's what makes Superman 1 is Lex Luthor. It's a very plausible strategy he's come up against this godlike character to take on.
Right.
And where I think Superman 1 is let down is it's got this tremendous buildup and this really clever way of taking out Superman and mitigating his powers. And then the series of events that happens from the point that Miss Tessmacher takes off the kryptonite off of the necklace that he's drowning in. From that point to the end, it kind of like I always feel like I could probably, I can not pause the film and just come back to it whenever. I don't feel like I'm, Jimmy's at the Hoover Dam and Lois is driving, and I'm just sort of like, and that for me is that's why I started to think that I think 2 is better, because I get enjoyment throughout 2, whereas 1, the end is just really sort of like a bunch of shit happens and he goes back in time and like it's not gratifying to watch him push a fault line back up. It's just like there's a lot of things that I have to sort of put together in my head the past 2.
The ending is the weak part. I think they would have been better off if he just saved Lois just in time, because I mean the idea that Superman could defeat an earthquake is kind of interesting. I'm not as offended by that, but that Superman,
I have to do a lot of work internally to like just enjoy the film, just to kind of get through that piece.
I mean, it is unfortunate that the Superman kind of, the last 20, 30 minutes are not the best 20, 30 minutes in that film. But well, at any rate, I still think though that the other thing is, like, you want to talk about ridiculous plot holes. Like, what? Lex Luthor's going to blow off, the existing coast of California because he's purchased this desert land, and he's going to have the new coast and no one's going to notice that.
Even it's not only that, it's how my wife isn't a superhero film fan, and we watched Superman 1 about 3 months ago.
Sure.
And she was taken back by how easy it was to get access to a nuclear weapon in America with Otis was able to get in. Otis was able to
I think that's a thing of the period, though. It was a common, remember, today we don't care about nuclear weapons anymore. It's not I mean, I guess they're still a threat, but they're not at the front of our minds. This is, written for a group of people who had to do like the duck under your desk drill, because if you duck under your wooden desk when the nuke hits, you'll be fine. Right. And the idea, though, that yes, like a bumbling fool like Otis, like that's all it takes is, somebody, Lex Luthor pretending to have a Texas accent while like Otis runs in and like, fiddles with the controls, and whoop-de-doo, you have a nuclear accident. That's very much of the period. I mean, that's the same period when the China Syndrome came out, right? Like, and that stars, that's not Gene Hackman, he's in the the other one, but I think that has to do with it's all of its moment.
Yeah. Well, it's been, I got to say, I really enjoyed this conversation today. I think here's where I think we sit with this. And this is my prediction. So I'm going to put it on the screen what I think the verdict is: Donner versus Lester. And I think we have to take our separate opinions in order here. I think it's a draw, really, because I'm heavily leaning towards Lester. I think you're heavily leaning towards Donner. I don't think we've come up with a clear-cut outcome.
I mean, we've said it before, but it's a little bit of an unfair situation, because the completed film Superman 2 is an enjoyable film. There's nothing wrong with it. I like it. I've watched it many times. And I'm comparing it against something that's more like a sketch, a draft, a what if, really. Something that can never be quite completed. And, one is a done product and the other is not. But if I'm judging based on where do I think Superman 2 would have gone under the direction of Richard Donner versus the direction of Richard Lester.
Yeah,
I have to probably say that what it boils down to, I'm a Superman fan, and I appreciate that Donner and his team were taking the character and what they were trying to do with it somewhat seriously. And I think that if it's easy to look at what Superman 2 is and say, well, so is Lester. But remember, he's using a lot of material that already existed. When he had a chance to film from scratch, you get Superman 3. And in Superman 3, it's very clear that he's not taking it all that seriously. And I think that
You back?
Am I? Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. How much?
I think
did
we
you
just
lose
cut
me
out.
for?
We lost you. I think you said, I think that, and then it cut out.
Well, I just said, I think with that in mind, that the Donner version, did you hear me saying about how the Donner version, he and his team were taking it more seriously than Lester was taking it. We got a glimpse, if you're curious, of what Lester would do given full control with Superman in Superman 3. And from Superman 3, it's very clear that Lester didn't take the material that seriously. And as a Superman fan, I prefer an approach. It's still a comic book movie. You still have to have a light touch. But I do appreciate that they were trying to bring some level of gravitas to the material. And so for that reason, I must side with the Donner vision.
Well, I think we leave it there, because I don't think there's something we're going to agree on. I think you sold me on quite a few points. It hasn't changed my view. And to every Superman fanboy who's going to give me shit about this, I've watched a lot of your videos, and I'm sorry. That's my opinion. You can love it or hate it. Come back the next time.
The world is differing opinions are what make the world go round, right?
That's
It would
right.
be
And this
boring
would have
if
been
we always.
Yeah, this would have been a boring chat had we agreed, I think, on it wouldn't have been boring, but I think this made it that much more interesting. So to everybody who's tuned in, thank you so much for joining. This is our second show, and please do like and subscribe, and we will be back on next week. We broadcast these every Friday. So again, Fridays, you will see our show. So please jump on again, and thank you for joining in. Take care, everybody.